The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Oh man, John 1:5 has been one of my favorite verses for most of my life. I absolutely love the defiance of it, the little sliver of hope that it points to, the sense that the light is just sticking it to the darkness. I can't tell you how many times I've preached on this verse, saying that no matter how dark and deep the darkness seems to get, the shining light of God is always able to break in. The darkness stands no chance against the light of God. But is that what this verse is saying? Is it about the light shining in the face of darkness, or is it possibly about something else entirely? Is the 5th verse actually connected to what comes later in the prologue, and therefore is making a larger theological and spiritual point? Let's see. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all peoples. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. This opening section of the prologue makes a clear shift from talking about the Logos, the Word, to talking about the light. And this shift is quite obviously intended to mean that what we have called the Logos in the first few verses is a few verses later also called the light. We've already seen that John has identified Christ as the Logos, and now with this shift, John is identifying Christ as the light as well. There is something of a connection between these two already. Many scholars have seen the prologue in the Gospel of John to be a dramatic reflection on the creation story in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis 1, verse 3, we see God do the first thing in the Bible. It's the first action of God. What does God do? God speaks. And when we speak, what is it that we normally speak with? Words. God spoke a word. And what was this spoken word? What did God say? Let there be light. Looking at Genesis in this way, the Word and the light are forever connected through this first word of God, which caused the light to shine out of the darkness. So, in the opening section of the prologue to John, it makes sense that there's a natural flow from Logos, the Word, to the light, especially if what John is pointing us towards is Genesis. We're going to go into some more depth here in the next session, but for now, let's just note that Jesus is the Word and the light, and that this isn't the first time in the Bible that Word and light have been found together. Now we need to look at what it might mean for the darkness to not overcome the light. The way this translation reads, it seems like the darkness and the light are these oppositional forces, struggling for control and dominance. But if John is pointing us back towards Genesis, in Genesis, there's no opposition between darkness and light. In fact, there's something of a harmony between the two. In Genesis, we find these familiar words. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. The light here doesn't obliterate the darkness. There's still darkness. And there's no sense in Genesis of darkness being something intrinsically evil. There's light, there's darkness, there's day, there's night. They coexist, albeit separately from each other. But there's no opposition here at all. So is John, reflecting on Genesis, inventing an opposition that wasn't there? Maybe not. The word that we typically translate here in John 1:5 as overcome is the Greek word katalabin. Katalabin can certainly mean overcome in the normal sense, like Napoleon's army was overcome by the Russians. But it can also mean to overcome in the sense of mentally grasping, mentally overcoming something. Like, I might say I tried to read Beowulf, but it was just too much for me. I couldn't overcome the language, which is why the King James Version of John 1:5 reads, "And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." Now, I know this sounds dubious because as far as we can tell, darkness doesn't have the intellectual capacity to comprehend anything. It's inanimate. Darkness doesn't think or wonder or argue or understand. It's just dark until someone, turns on the light. But seeing John 1:5 as saying that the darkness didn't understand the light does open the prologue up to the point where we can see a new pattern that we might not have seen before. In John 1:5, there is light, but let's say the darkness didn't comprehend it. A few verses later, we see the light begin to refer to as a he, which makes total sense if we understand both the Logos and the light to be Christ. And then in verse 10, we find he was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. And then in verse 11, we find he came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. So the light was in the darkness, but the darkness did not understand it. The light was in the world, but the world did not know it. The light came to his own, but his own did not accept it. Do you see a pattern here? Preeminent biblical scholar from nearby Princeton University, Elaine Pagels, calls this pattern the Three Negations. She says that what John is saying here is that in the beginning, God caused the light, the Logos, to shine. This was a revelation of God. God was trying to reveal this light, this Logos, to the cosmos. But the light, the Logos, was not understood, known, or accepted until verse 14. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Looking at John's prologue in this way, there are two acts to the great divine drama. The first act happens in the beginning when the light is made manifest. The second act happens in the Incarnation when the light takes on flesh and bone in the person of Jesus Christ. Up until this second act, the light, the Logos, was just missed. We missed it. We failed to acknowledge it. We failed to accept it until Jesus came at Bethlehem, until Jesus began his ministry, until Jesus was lifted high upon the cross for all the world to see. Then we beheld his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son. What Elaine Pagels sees here is John telling us his major theological insight, his principal message. The incarnation of Jesus changed everything. John wasn't alone in this insight. We see it in the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse, for though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Paul says that just because Gentile pagans didn't have the Hebrew Bible or know the stories of creation or the Exodus, it's not an excuse. For, Paul says, God could have been just as easily seen and understood through creation, through the things that God has made, but they failed to honor him as God or give thanks to him. And that was the beginning of the slippery slope that led to the absolute debasement of the pagans. I think John would agree with Paul here. Mostly. Maybe not entirely, because Paul is only picking on the pagans here. But John seems to say that even God's own people failed to accept the light, the Logos. For John, the failure to comprehend, know, and accept Christ as Christ was found to be in the cosmos from the beginning. It is a universal human condition until Jesus' coming in the flesh, which is why perhaps John begins his gospel with this grand hymn to Christ. This Christ, this Logos, this light who altered the fabric of the universe when he came among us. Now, Elaine Pagels and other scholars see John doing something else here too, and it's another sign that she might be onto something with this identification of the three negations. John appears to be saying something with these negations and his insistence on the principal importance of Jesus coming among us that directly contradicts the spiritual insights of some other first century texts. John may have heard other people talking about Jesus in a way he thought was so wrong that he wrote his gospel to refute their position. And that's exactly what we'll be looking at in the next session.